Just wait for everyone to join. Good morning, everyone. My name is Zwagele Mbanja. We're just waiting for a couple of people to join, and then we'll get underway. Good to see you this Wednesday morning. And I'm excited to spend the next 2 hours with you. 2.5 hours or so that we can discuss personal information impact assessments and how to do them. I'm joined by Taylor Pinto, and we both will be taking you through our masterclass. But let's give it maybe a minute or two, maybe even three, just to get more people underway. We had quite a few people who had registered. So we want to make sure that we start at the same point. So at when it hits the 3 minute mark, if you'll allow me, we'll then get into it because we have quite a few things to then get through today. But whilst you're at that, please do use the chat box to interact with us. I'm hoping today. In fact, I'd like today to be a very interactive session so that we can get quite a few of those issues that you have and address them head on. If we don't know, then we'll get back to you also on that. PIAs or PIIAs or DPIAs, as you'll come to know all the confusing terminology are quite an interesting creature in data protection law that is confusing to some degree, and particularly the how to do that becomes another element that is quite confusing as well. So, really want to hear what experiences you are having with doing your PIIAs, but then also what questions you might have with respect to them. So, going to pause here, allow 1 or 2 minutes to pass, and then, as I said, at the 3 minute mark, we'll then get into it. Please do in the chat section say hi. Let us know who you are, which organization you're joining from, and use the Q&A section as well to mention your any questions that you have or any comments. And between Taylor and myself, we'll flag those and then get into it. Taylor, I want to say hi.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. I'm just here to support Swakele today. So I'll be keeping an eye on the chat and the Q&A box. As he said, if you've got any thoughts, comments, or questions, please reach out. We're happy to engage with you and actually encourage some participation. But yeah, I'm excited to get into the session.
Mm. Right. Morning, Kristen. Hello, Marie. Hi, Tabo. Can see people are saying hi in the chat box. Right. Okay, it's at 3 minute mark now. Gonna give it 1 more minute because I'm a great guy. Hi, Surya. Hi, Rehat. All right. I think we can start now. Whoever's not here will find us on the way. But I do encourage everyone to also talk amongst yourselves in the chat section as well. You might have insights that you want to share with the group. I'm really hoping to use today to help us, number one, to deliver a masterclass to you so that you understand really what PIIAs are, why they're important, and then how to conduct them. And then secondly, to then get into really the practical aspects of it. So I'd like you guys to talk to each other, talk to us, make it as interactive as possible so that we can get as much as we can out of the session. It is 2 hours, so I will be taking a break at some point. Really, it's meant to be content, insights, discussion, and then we have a little gift for you at the end of the session if you stay until then. So I'm going to share my screen now. If you can see my screen, please just give it a thumbs up. Um, and then I'll know that
All good?
all good.
Okay.
So today is a PIIA session. That's a personal information impact assessment masterclass session. So I'm going to get into a bit more about the different acronyms and the different terminology, just so that you can start to get your wrap your head around everything. But as I mentioned about 5 minutes ago, my name is Zwagele Mbanjwa. If you haven't seen me or heard from me, I'm an attorney at Michelson's. I specialize in data and emerging technology laws and regulations and helping companies comply with that, particularly within the data aspect of it. I think data protection is particularly where we are today. And PIAs are something that I do quite a bit with my clients who are in different parts of the world or have businesses in different parts of the world. So really keen to get to give you some insights from that and also hear from you around what are the challenges that you're facing and what kinds of things in designing maybe some of your PIAs are you struggling with or even implementing them. I'm joined by Taylor Pinto, also an attorney at Michelson's, or specializing in data protection, IT goods and services. And she'll be supporting me in looking at the chat box and also jumping in wherever she wants to add some of her notes. So today really is what today is going to look like is that I'm just going to start off with wanting to give you a little refresher so that you understand where we are, particularly when we're talking about PIAs, give you a bit of context, move over to the legal and regulatory requirements. Look a bit at the triggers for the PIA so that you understand particularly the when to do one, because that almost is the tricky one. Operationalizing privacy by design, because PIAs are really meant to be part of your privacy framework, or what Papier calls a privacy compliance framework. They're meant to be part of that. Then we're going to do some exercises just to get you into the spirit of the PIIA, and then we'll end off with a interactive Q&A session. I do encourage you to ask questions along the way, so you don't have to wait until the end to ask your questions. You pop them in the chat. We are a small enough group, so from time to time, depending on my benevolence, I might allow you to also talk to the group as well, just so that we can hear each other out. But this is really the lay of the land today. We're going to do this over 2 hours. Really, the first hour is really a content hour so that you understand the lay of the land, and then we go into more of the practical sessions. But now, onto the refresher aspect of it. I'm assuming, so maybe I want to start off with assumptions that I'm making in the session, and if anybody is not on the same page here, please let me know in the chat box. So I'm assuming all of you can answer these questions, right? You can answer what papier is. You can answer what personal information is, when processing takes place, who are the role players, who's your information officer, securing personal information, and. The reason why it's important to lay this context is because I'm going to be relying on this assumption within the session. So if there's anything amongst the questions that I've raised here that you don't know or you maybe are a bit behind on, please let me know in the chat. I'm happy to answer those questions live. But I just want to be on the same page, and I think I see the thumbs up that everybody's on the same page around being able to answer these questions. Can give me one last thumbs up. There we go. Perfect. So now, based off of that, I think want to now understand how many of you have had, I mean, and Taylor, if you can help me launch the poll, is how many of you have actually worked on a PIIA? So I see quite a few people have done one. There's 4 people who haven't done one. I think the responses are still coming in. Okay, I'm going to end the poll right there, share the results. So about 64% of you here have done a PIA and some of you have not. So really keen to hear from the 64% who have what your challenges have been, and please put those in the chat. But I think it's also for the people who haven't done one, I'll then want to start at firstly to properly do a PIA. It's important to understand the basics, right? Because PIAs are a bit more of an advanced data protection knowledge because you're looking at the actual operations of privacy once you get into that phase. And it's then important, particularly, I think we start our journey at the 8 conditions of lawful processing. So contextually, you need to, a responsible party needs to be, is accountable for processing personal information, must limit the processing, must have a purpose for processing the personal information, must limit further processing. The information must be of a good quality. There must be openness. There must be certain security standards that are applied, which are technical and organizational, and there must also be data subject participation. This is the bedrock of doing a PIA, because you'll see that once we get into the actual nitty-gritties of it, you keep on coming back to these conditions of processing. So particularly when you look at when you do one, and I'll touch a bit more about what that looks like, but it touches on these 8 conditions of processing. So a foundational knowledge of data protection is important to successfully do one, because when you're going through your questionnaire, and each of those steps, which we'll get into later, the conditions of lawful processing become really the lens upon which you judge whether there is a risk on a data subject's personal information rights or data subject rights or privacy. Um, so then what then is a PIA? So with that foundation, why do we do PIAs? We do them because we want to make sure that the way in which we're processing personal information of a data subject does not pose a heightened risk, right? And that heightened is very important terminology. So it's a risk beyond the ordinary, right? To a data subject's rights. And we'll get into that a bit more about what that risk means and what that risk means within the context of your organization. And this is where it becomes important to understand that privacy, and really what I am an evangelist for, is that privacy and compliance risk are not imagined outside of an organization's existing risk management framework. They are within that risk management framework, and then compliance risk is a specific risk within that risk management framework, and then privacy compliance risk is a specific one is a specific risk within compliance risk. Now, that cascading effect is important because when you look at what heightened risk means, it needs to be a combination of one, what your risk management framework is saying around your risk appetite and the lot, coupled with what the law says around particularly data subject data protection risk, and that's contained in PAPIA, contained in the CCPA, contained in the GDPR. So what you then start seeing within this instance is that most organizations, what you should be doing rather, is taking your existing risk management plan or risk management framework rather, and localizing it, right, to understanding or localizing it to the privacy context. So, for example, if your general risk management framework says that you are number one, it's a risk-based approach. You use a risk-based approach. Number two, your red risks are risks that are trigger regulatory fines, right? Now, if that is part of your um, if that is part of your general risk, right, your general risk framework, that your red risk is it's triggered by regulatory fines, then you go to Papier to look at when are regulatory fines attracted. And most times that's where account numbers are related. So that means that within your risk framework or your privacy compliance risk, specific privacy compliance risk framework, you are looking at risks that your red risks are always going to be risks that where processing involves account numbers. This is important because it's your high risk processing activities that you almost always will be doing PIIAs for. So, number one, that's the purpose of them. You want to understand what is the risk to a data subject's rights. And those rights are contained in the Constitution, insofar as privacy rights and access to information rights, but also from a perspective of the rights contained in PAPIA, from access, deletion, and so far as the conditions for lawful processing as well. So that really then becomes the basis. Now, from a business value point of view, PIAs are also really great because they allow you to deploy resources where you need them most. So if you are following a risk-based approach within your environment, PIIAs allow you to know, right, where to understand the nature and the DNA of your processing related risks, which then allow you to then deploy the right kind of resources in certain controls that you might find from your PIIA you need to implement, or might allow you to even not do something and do, or rather not deploy resources in one direction and deploy them in a different direction as far as your budgeting is concerned and. But I want to quickly go into the law and just start here. So this idea of a personal information impact assessment comes from the PAPIA regulations in a South African context. So if you look at the regulations in subsection 4(1)(b), it says that an information officer must, in addition to the responsibilities referred to in PAPIA, which speaks about the responsibilities of an information officer, ensure that a personal information impact assessment is done to ensure that adequate measures and standards exist in order to comply with the conditions of lawful processing. So here we see two things, or three things rather. One, that PIAs are the responsibility of the information officer. Two, that the information officer must ensure that they're done. And three, that in the way in which they do them, the PIIA in a South African context must take heed of the conditions for lawful processing. And so that's why I start at a conditions of lawful processing place, because in a South African context, those conditions are very important in the way in which you do your personal information impact assessment. Now, the interesting thing here is that this is probably the only times in PAPIA, the regulations and any guidance, you'll see the word personal information impact assessment. That's a bit troubling because what this means is that there isn't any guidance, right? So in South Africa, there's no further guidance beyond this section in the regulations that really speaks about having that you need to do a PIIA, but as to how you do one, the South African regulator hasn't quite given guidance within that respect. So in line with PAPIA, which allows us to look to other jurisdictions when we have exhausted in the legal a universe of South Africa, PAPIA allows us to look elsewhere in the world. Where then do we see this a creature, a legal creature that looks like a personal information impact assessment? So in global language, you hear two other kinds of terminology or abbreviations. One is a privacy impact assessment, and two is a data protection impact assessment. Both of these things bear a striking resemblance to what we see in South Africa as a personal information impact assessment. And as Michelson's and as myself, as well as the team, we have come to a point that we believe that a personal information impact assessment is the same as a data protection impact assessment, which is also the same as a privacy impact assessment. And in China, for example, they use different terminology, which we'll get into. So then when you're looking to other jurisdictions to guide you on how to do this thing that the South African law requires of you, you're looking at terminology, you're looking at sections that are speaking to DPIAs or PIAs. Now, if we head on over to the GDPR in Article 30 speaks about the data protection impact assessment and has possibly more guidance around when is it triggered, what is expected when you do one, and who then needs to do one. And specifically, it says when a type of processing, in particularly using new technologies, taking into account nature, scope, context, and purpose of the processing, is likely to result in high risk. Here's this concept of risk again to the rights and freedoms of natural persons. In South Africa, it also includes juristic persons. So note that. The controller, being the responsible party in South Africa, prior to processing, and this becomes an important thing, must carry out an assessment of the impact which is envisaged, or rather which is foreseen on processing operations on the protection of personal data. So what are we seeing here? So from a South African point of view, it says information officer, do this PIA assessment, and you're looking at it from the context of the conditions of lawful processing. But South Africa doesn't say, do you do it before before you decide, before you embark on a new processing activity, or do you do it retrospectively, right? South Africa doesn't also speak on the specific triggers, right? Which are spoken to a bit here. And this furthermore, which this section then goes into. So the added layer then that we're looking at from a DPIA point of view is that almost always when you're using new technologies, you're going to do a PIA, right, or DPIA. So these new technologies could involve the new enterprise resource planning software. It could involve using artificial intelligence or deploying artificial intelligence within your environment, using CRM, a new CRM platform, like you weren't using Salesforce before, now you're using Salesforce or another CRM platform. But any kind of new technology within your operations that you're looking to do, the GDPR says you want to, when that new technology is going to result in a high risk to the rights and freedoms of data subjects, do a DPIA. So this idea then, or rather this concept of a high risk becomes an important foundation to get right. Why? Because it is that risk, that risk rating that is going to essentially give you a sense of when to do a PIA or not. And I'm going to get into a bit more about that because this is where records of processing activities become really important, being your ropers. So then it goes into a whole bunch of stuff, but essentially this is where you're looking to in the GDPR for a concept or a creature that is similar to a PIIA. Then we look over to China, right, with their personal information protection law. So Article 55 in China says that a personal information processor could be a responsible party in different kinds of processes. It's got different definitions there, and we'll get into that. Or rather, understanding the role players becomes important. Shall conduct a personal information protection impact assessment. So we're already seeing different terminology. We've seen PIIA, we've seen DPIA, and now we're seeing a PIPIA, right? Which is a personal information protection impact assessment on the following circumstances in advance. I see I see the laughing there. We don't even if a new there might be a new market within your within your existing jurisdictions, and they'll call it something else. I don't know, like an LOL. And again, You need to have the discernment within your operations of knowing, am I speaking about the same thing? Because you can imagine the cost of compliance for and establishing a whole new activity and a whole new control is quite costly when you can actually embed that into an existing process. So that's why I want to go through this exercise with you of this concept of PIIA lives in different forms and different kinds of legislations, and depending on your regulatory universe and where you're operating and the laws that are impacted by you, you're going to have to know where to look for one so that you know what is the standard required of doing one within that jurisdiction. So in China, they're saying you must do one in advance. So where PAPIA and the regulations doesn't speak about when to do one, the DPIA in GDPR and in China, the PIPL is saying you need to do one before you engage in a processing activity. And then it goes and speaks about the kinds of processing activities that you are looking at there. So processing sensitive personal information, making use of personal information to make automated decisions, and trusting others to process personal information and right? So this is where you're looking at from a Chinese point of view. So we've got a PIIA, a DPIA, and a PIPIA. God, I hope I remember all of the different acronyms. Now let's look to the US, right? The US is a federated model, as you'd understand. And in the US, there's a couple of jurisdictions. So, from a US point of view, you don't have a federated data protection law. What you have, rather, and what has almost been emphasized in this recent administration as well is the power of states to make their own laws. So quite a few states actually do have data protection laws. It's not just California, because everybody speaks about the CCPA, whenever they talk about the US as almost the only law that exists. But there's others in other laws, and I wanted to take a different approach and look at Virginia. So in the Code of Virginia, it talks about data protection assessments. So a DPA. And not a DPA as in your data processing addendum or agreement, and not a DPA as in a data protection authority. It's a DPA as in a data protection assessment. The reason why I'm going through, all of these different acronyms is because it becomes very important for you to be sharp enough to cut through the acronyms and get to the actual crux of what a regulator is asking for you, and understanding the different acronyms, and sometimes even how acronyms can, say the same thing. It can be the same letters, but you're talking about different things in different contexts, like a DPA in this instance. So understanding the context upon which questions are being asked, and also understanding the context of the law in which you're seeking to comply with, then becomes really important. So from a Virginia point of view, and effective as of this year in January, a controller must conduct and document a data protection assessment on each one of these processing activities, right? Again, this idea of triggers. Processing for targeted advertising, processing when it's the sale of personal data, profiling, processing sensitive data, and any processing activities involving personal data, which presents a heightened risk of harm to consumers. And that heightened risk element again goes into having a clear risk framework, and I would even go as far as saying a data protection risk framework that you use to then risk rate. And which should be speaking together, or speaking with rather the organizational risk management framework as well. And then it goes into a whole bunch of stuff about how you need to do one, and the way in which you then need to conduct that DPA. And then there's more laws around the world. South Korea has one. Japan also has one. Brazil also has their data protection law. Nigeria also has one. In fact, in Nigeria, they are even trying to make sure that DPIAs, they're trying to establish um, a portal where you're going to do that you can use to do your DPIAs. And Section 28 of the Nigerian Data Protection Act then speaks really around, the requirement of having a DPIA and when you are required to do one. Again, those trigger activities. So, what is it? It's an assessment really to check to check whether there's a heightened risk to data subject rights, and what measures are in place to reduce that risk, and whether you should even proceed with that processing activity. Who needs to do it? From a South African point of view, the information officer remains responsible for it. But remember that information officers have their teams. So you'll have your designated, which is your CEO. Usually you have your appointed, which then would be someone who's appointed as via an appointment letter as an information officer and a deputy information officer, and they would have a team depending on the size of your organization and depending on your operating model. You then could decide who, if it's maybe one person specifically responsible for it, or you design a process where you work together with certain teams, for example, a marketing team, and you have a data steward or a data champion in there who is able to monitor the processing activities that are taking place in line with the ROPA of that department, and then works with your information officer and works with your information officer and their team to then do one. It depends on your operating model, and we can discuss different operating models a bit more. I'd be keen to also find out from you what your organization's operating model for data protection compliance looks like. So that's the who. And then also from a who perspective, you're looking at who's the critical subject in PIIAs, DPIAs, PIPLs, PIPIAs, PIAs, and LOLs. It is the data subject. You're specifically looking always at the data subject and the impact of what you're doing on the data subject. Then the when are the trigger occasions. Again, from a POPIA point of view, it doesn't really have clear triggers, only to say that you must do one to ensure that adequate measures and standard exist in order to comply. That's not a hell of a lot of proper guidance, but from a DPIA, a PIPL, a DPA, a point of view, we're seeing that from a best practice, if we look at all of these laws, from a best practice point of view, you're doing PIAs. I'm going to call them for the purpose of this, for the purpose of this session. I'm going to call them PIIAs, but I hope all of you will understand what I'm talking about. I'm confusing myself now. From a PIA point of view, best practice point of view, you're looking at it should be done before you embark on a processing activity, right? And what kind of processing activity? A processing activity which poses a high risk, right? A heightened risk to a data subject's rights. That really is, in summary, then what you're looking at from a best practice point of view of when to do one. So that really is the legal lay of the land, and really wanted to. They are mandatory, as you can see within the laws. So you can't choose to do one or not to do one, but you're following a principle-based approach, and that principle is based off of your risk framework, right? So they are mandatory when you're looking at heightened risk processing activities, and you want to be doing them before you engage in that processing activity. But I think I want to pause here to talk about the reality of the situation, right? In certain instances, you're only just getting into the flow of your data protection program. And so you might have already embarked on a processing activity, and you would not have done a PIIA or DPA for that. Now, there's a couple of ways in which you can approach that instance. One, you can, in the way in which you design your ROPA, you can put in PIIA aspects to it. So remember, a ROPA is a factual, it's a record of processing activity, and it's a factual image of the processing that's taking place within your organization in most instances, by the different departments. But particularly, it then gives you a single point of truth of all the processing taking place within your organization, what we call mapping your activities in certain instances. What I like to do for my clients with their ROPAs is, in that ROPA, I include an aspect which speaks to risk rating. And I'm going to later on show you a template ROPA. If you're a member of our program, you'll have access to the template to our ROPA. But there's a risk rating aspect to the ROPA. Why? Because while you're mapping your activities, we want to see at that point what are your high risk processing activities, right? So, for example, you could be a financial services company, right? In this financial services company, you provide credit, right? And as part of your credit operations, there's an approval process. Now, we know that financial information is information on account numbers, triggers fines when it's mismanaged. But also, it's one of the categories of information that, particularly from a South African point of view, has extra scrutiny because of the level of harm that a data subject can experience. That's why, for example, from a Financial Services Conduct Authority and your Prudential Authority, you're seeing things like the joint standards on cybersecurity and cyber resilience coming out because of the importance of securing financial information and the financial information of data subjects, because of the propensity for harm and the level and the extent of harm that can take place when someone, for example, is financial information is misused by a bad actor, and they can lose monies and. But also from a financial inclusion point of view. And financial inclusion and credit is an important part of the financial inclusion conversation, right? So now you are a credit provider and you are doing approvals of whether to provide credit or not. Now, you already are doing this processing activity. It's not a new processing activity. It's part of what you do already. So from a DPI, from a GDPR and Chinese and even US instances and US state instance in certain examples, you already are too late to the party, right? But from what our information regulator has said, in that they want to see that organizations, particularly responsible parties, but also processes who are processing high risk, who are involved in high risk processing activities and engaged in and using special personal information, that you are proactive. So from a factual point of view, you already are too late, but there's nothing that prevents you from doing one retrospectively. It might not necessarily be a DPIA in the strict sense, but if you're looking at your ROPA and wanting to have it live in your ROPA, you could have columns in your ROPA that then speak to the same things that you'd be looking at from a PIIA point of view. So, for example, if your PIIA is asking you to risk rate, you have that risk rating on your ROPA already, and you could also do this by software. We'll speak about software a bit later. If your PIA is asking you to, for example, assess the impact on the data subject, you could have columns that maybe a notes column that speaks to, based off of this processing activity and the personal information involved and the controls that we have in place. This is our comment on this risk. and that almost could fill that retrospective purpose. But really, the purpose of a PIA is meant to give you foresight. It means to give you a sense before you engage into the activity. But I know that some of you would have already engaged in the activity, and so you don't have that foresight going in, and you're discovering that foresight whilst you're working. So the roper is one place that you can have that assessment live, or you can do an assessment. You could even call it a DPIA or a PIIA, and go through the exact same process. It's just that from a recommendations point of view, you'd be doing remediation rather than setting up new controls. So that's the element that I wanted to touch on around this aspect, this part about doing them in advance or whilst you're already engaged in a processing activity. What is important though is that your high risk processing activities, that those have PIIAs that have been done for them. Because if ever you get on the wrong side of the regulator, and we know that the regulator in South Africa has already asked WhatsApp to provide them with the PIIA, is that you want to be able to, when the regulator comes, say, this is what I've done. I've been proactive. These are the controls that I need to that I identified needed to be in place. Those are, controls exist, and I'm continuously monitoring them and making sure that we are monitoring their impact to the data subjects' rights and. So really, that's what regulators are expecting. They want documentary evidence. I mean, if you look at the wording in Virginia, they want a document. So there should be a document. It can't be a process in the air, first of all. At the same as that is true with GDPR. And I could even go as far as PAPIA as well, is that although they don't specifically speak about a document, that's the only way really you're able to evidence that something has taken place. Now, from a document point of view, of course, you can have software that does this for you. But one of the things that you want to look at through from a software point of view is one, can you export a final assessment that you can then submit? Or can you provide access to a regulator or a third party that might want to see your PIA in almost a closed environment where you'd give them maybe certain credentials that they only have access to and be able to then engage with your the PIIA report that you have. So, I mean, I want to pause after this to just flag if there's any questions and the lot. But the last point that I want to then speak about here is the consequences of skipping one, right? So I've spoken about, the innocence of not doing one because you already are involved in a processing activity, because by the time you realize that you need to do a DPIA or a PIA, you had already engaged in that processing activity. So the retrospective measures that you can put in place is the way in which you design your ROPA is one that takes into account the PIA, or you can just do the PIA, but then in the way in how you speak to it and the recommendations that you put in at the end or even in the introduction do explain that you did this almost within the processing activity and not in advance, and the reasons why you do that. But there are instances where people are not doing them because they don't, number one, they are a lot of work, and they are a lot of work. I think that's something not to overlook. PIAs are a hell of a lot of work because one, there's a data gathering exercise. And then two, there's a synthesizing exercise really of understanding what all of this information data, the way in which you're doing things means for the data subject and their rights. Then there is the actual risk rating aspect of it, and getting to the right risk level so that the controls that you put in place are then adequate and effective. So it is a lot of work, and some organizations decide not to do one. That's definitely not you because you're here in the session. But if you're wanting to almost put a business case before the business and your organization around why it's important to do one, it doesn't only have a data protection value, it also has business values, which is what a business value, which is what I've found. So, for example, it helps product managers, people who are designing products or services just designed better within the process. So, for example, if your organization is looking to, I don't know, install, maybe you are a vehicle manufacturer. And in your vehicle manufacturing, you've got this a futuristic project where you are, it's not even futuristic, it's present, which are self-driving vehicles. So you've got a self-driving vehicle and you want to maybe put AI into your self-driving vehicle. Now, the way in which you design that AI component, you teach that LLM, you train that LLM, you put in certain checks and balances, you decide which developer to use. Is it OpenAI? Is it Anthropic? Is it DeepSeek? Who is it? Or do you develop your own? The way in which the product team makes those decisions can be influenced by the PIA or the DPIA. Because, for example, if you find that the processing activity that you're about to embark on, let's say it is the use of artificial intelligence within your vehicles and your vehicle's computing system, now it's learning, right? And it's learning all of this information. But the fundamental model that's being used is maybe based in a country that is not doesn't have adequate protection of data subject rights. If you've built on top of that, right? If you've built your artificial intelligence system on top of an LLM by a developer who's hosting it in a country that doesn't have adequate protections of data subjects as maybe required by your regulator or regulators that are more stringent in some of your markets, you might have to decommission that AI in your vehicles, which is a whole lot of, which is a big cost. So why don't you do it from the beginning? Essentially, design privacy into the product development process, and privacy impact assessments then, in that instance, come to shine as a mechanism and a tool to design privacy within the product development and the service development aspect that business and commercial is most interested in. So the consequences of skipping them are dire, particularly when the processing activity is critical or key, either from a revenue point of view, from a regulatory point of view, or any other or reputational point of view within whatever risk framework that you have around the key risks that you need to manage and that you need to be on top of. PIIAs then are able to help you design right and have foresight in the kinds of activities that you then engage in. So, want to pause, I think, a bit there. Taylor, are there any questions?
Yes, there is a question for you. The question is it correct that you only do a PIIA if you identify the processing activity as being high risk?
Yes. So as you've seen, it's yes for me. Why? Because PIIAs are most useful. The use for them is when there's a heightened risk to your processing activities. But the critical points there is one, how are you risk rating? Right, which is what I've been really preaching this entire time. That becomes really important, your risk rating methodology. Two, when are you identifying this? Is it before you're engaging in this, or whilst you are already smack bam within the processing that needs to take place? And so then those become really important nuances in then doing your PIIAs. Any other questions? So let's get into a bit more on that risk part. So I'm going to skip ahead. I'm going to skip ahead to the triggers, and then I'll go back and I'll tell you why. So if you looked at these acts, and maybe not pop here, let's go to GDPR and the others. So if you look at GDPR and you look at the Chinese law, Nigerian law, and the lot, they've got certain activities that they already deem as risky, right? So new technologies. Already AI is in this bucket. So whenever you're using AI, because AI is generally understood as this new technology, and particularly in the LLM models that have been coming out, so using natural language processing and the lot. So using innovative technologies, but it's not just AI, it's other kinds of technologies also that you could be, excuse me, that you could use that you're using, maybe you're powering those technologies via data, right? Personal data specifically. So, and then from a papier point of view, automated decision making is a trigger activity. So that's already risky. Um, in, in, in Virginia, you're looking at targeted advertising is another one. In certain laws, let me see, in China, you're looking at where is this? Processing sensitive personal information, so special personal information. In other laws, there's data matching, right? So those are activities that in certain laws are already deemed risky. So you're not going to, whenever that processing activity is involved, you need to do a PIA for, right? But this comes out, and I want to really explain the DNA of where these triggers come from. So let's take a step back to the fundamentals. We know what personal information is. It's any information that identifies a person: race, gender, contact, financial, medical, employment, criminal, education. Yeah, we're on the same page about that. Two, we know that and here I'm focusing more on the South African context. We know that there's certain categories of personal information that's called special personal information. So race and ethnicity, criminal behavior, health, biometric information, trade union membership. Then, from a South African point of view, we also have the Constitution. So, in the Bill of Rights, let me go and give you a short law lesson. So, in the Bill of Rights, Chapter 2, to be exact, you've got equality, right? You've got Section 9, really that speaks about equality. And when you look at equality, it says state may not unfairly discriminate directly and indirectly on any one of these grounds, right? And you see that quite a few of these grounds match to the special, in the category of special personal information, right? That we just saw. So you're already starting to see that what is envisaged here is that whenever you're engaged in processing, firstly, because we're designing a risk framework right here, whenever you're involved in processing, there's going to involve special personal information. That should be the first bell that rings around the impact being high. Remember, when you're risk rating, you're looking at impact and probability. What's the impact on the data subject? And then what's the probability / likelihood of that impact materializing? And so then what does it mean for the inherent risk of that processing activity? Then if you put in a control, does this control significantly reduce or reduce how far does this control reduce the impact or the probability of the impact materializing? And that's where then you'll land at a residual risk, right? So we already are starting to see that whenever the processing has to do with special personal information, your impact is already high, right? So race, ethnicity, criminal behavior, health, biometric, trade union membership. I then in South Africa would then extend to what the Constitution then deems as specific areas that you can't unfairly discriminate. So you're looking at disability, religion, conscious belief, culture, language, and it's contained in the test for this is also in a law called PAPUDA, which is the Prevention of Unlawful Discrimination Act, the Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unlawful Discrimination Act, right? So that is the first, from an impact point of view, you're looking at what's the impact to the data subject specifically based off of this processing activity. Then you want to look at the likelihood of it materializing. So here, if the way in which you're processing means that you're looking at this piece of personal information all the time, and it's a core part of your processing activities, you already are starting to see that impact, the likelihood of that impact materializing on the data subjects, right, is a bit high, right? For example, financial information, if you're using financial information, and every time you are doing credit applications, you are realizing that's a day-to-day of a financial institution that's providing credit, right? So the likelihood of making a bad credit decision or a credit decision that is unfairly discriminates on a data subject is high, but because of the controls maybe that you put in place, it might become lower. I'm just looking at inherent risk at this point in time. So that really is how the trigger criteria are come to be. The foundations are the personal information itself. And then you look at this against your conditions of lawful processing. And that really lands you to a kind of a risk rating methodology and framework. And different organizations will then use a different one based off of and influenced by their existing risk management framework by the risk team around, for example, if we spoke about that example I made earlier, which was a financial information. So maybe from a risk framework point of view, anything that lands you with the fine is a red risk. In this instance, financial information, which is not special personal information, but it is personal information, then becomes a key area within your risk, your privacy compliance or risk framework to then consider. Because this is what will then materialize in a fine based off of papier and most times than not. And that's how you then piece together a risk rating framework that you can then use against your ROPA to determine what are your high risk processing activities, and as a result, which ones, the high risk processing, the processing activities which have been deemed high risk, to then do PIIAs for, or if a new processing activity is being engaged in, for that to then trigger a PIA as well. So getting then into the triggers, and I think I want to turn to you here just a bit. So when you look at your organization, and please add in the chat, and also I might allow you to speak as well, is that when you look at your organization, I know some of you are in the financial services sector, some of you are software providers and software as a service providers, some of you are in healthcare, some of you are in the motor industry. When do you think there's a heightened risk to data subjects and their rights? So anyone can put their hand up or add into the chat. So if you look at your business as it stands currently, where are you seeing a heightened risk based off of really what we've spoken about up until this point on when to do a PIA? Any takers? Taylor, any thoughts?
I think as soon as you start, like you said, moving into something new, I think we've seen a lot of AI adoption recently. And I think with that AI adoption beyond the sort of standard acceptable use, I think it's going to trigger the need for PIAs as well.
Mm. No, I 100% agree with you there. I think when you talk about the actual practicalities of AI, and which has really been what I've been trying to of late talk to more people about, is when you look at over and above the buzzwords of AI. AI involves data. And the interesting thing about AI particularly is that you're not only dealing with input data, which is the data that you put in, but AI is also capable of generating new kinds of personal information. So you definitely are looking at PIAs within that instance, with the kind of personal information that's being generated there, but also in the ways in which the use cases that you're looking to deploy AI. So if you, for example, are monitoring, so maybe you've got a logistics company, and you're monitoring drivers. Or maybe you've got in your healthcare a business, you're looking at using AI to help you diagnose certain illnesses. I know there's been use cases around breast cancer research and the lot. Or from a financial services point, you're looking at automated decision making, particularly for credit, because that's, I think, the biggest one. But I'm going to turn to the chat. I see Jan says, when processing data subject location information. I agree. Because your geolocation and the harm that can materialize around that geo-tracking information, if you don't manage it effectively, is, someone, we know a whole host of harms. A bad actor can get a hold of that information, loss of reality. People have been doxxed before also on social media, online. But of course, the more you put controls around this, the lesser that risk then materializes. So yes, yeah, and I do agree. Maria says we considered doing a PIA based on sensitive type of personal information, and confidential information being processed, especially with migration to cloud services. Great one, Maria, because also I think you would have seen from the Chinese law, whenever you're also transferring information cross-border, and that's really the cloud business. You are China requires you to do this personal information impact assessment, and you'd know that that's over and above the transfer impact assessment that you'd already be having to do. So assessments, assessments, assessments. But definitely sensitive type of personal information, I agree. And confidential information as well. But remember, with confidential information, it has to be personal information, right? So confidential information that is not personal information doesn't then trigger a PIIA, because you're only interested in information relating to a data subject because we're wanting to assess the impact on the data subject. Biometric information is part of sensitive personal information. So I know quite a few use cases now in various industries are coming up and wanting to use biometric information. We know that in South Africa, for example, you've got the regulator has they have they actually released the guidance note, Taylor? But it's the guidance note on gated communities.
Yet.
And you know that at gated communities, sometimes they take a fingerprint, sometimes they take in certain, and gated communities and also include office buildings. I've been to some clients' headquarters and they take even your iris scans. So that's also an example of special personal information. John says, whenever a new processing activity is initiated. So yes, but specifically a processing activity, a new processing activity with the heightened risk, right? So it becomes very important to have your risk triggers, John. And I'd be really keen to hear insofar as how do you trigger, how are those risk triggers? So if you, for example, are involved in and you're in the motor vehicle industry. So you are taking maybe a new type of personal information from dealerships, right? Because you have a relationship with dealerships. Is that new information that you're taking or that new service that you're providing to dealerships, is it going to pose a heightened risk to data subjects or not? And how do you then determine that? And usually, because and I think this is also something to say as well, is that because of just how time consuming and resource requiring PIIAs are, you're wanting to be doing PIIAs where you need to do them, right? And some organizations have chosen an approach where they're indiscriminate. They do a PIIA for everything. That's not necessarily best practice, especially as you've seen from law. You're looking specifically as where there's heightened risk. And particularly that heightened risk, the first level of that heightened risk is those trigger activities. So what we've spoken about, um, go to the screen, processing special personal information, tracking, large-scale processing, and then beyond that, triggers based off of your risk management framework. So that when you move on beyond, okay, our risk, the processing activity has triggered the red triggers, and our risk management compliance framework will then go on into getting more information about that processing activity. So you just want to be careful there around, and that's particularly from a risk, or rather a resource management perspective. Kamishka, any new use of technology where personal information is processed, any possible guidance, nurse research? Yes. So, for example, from a marketing point of view, you know that there's a direct marketing guidance note by the information regulator. And we can pretty much tell that direct marketing is one of the things, and quite a few regulators lists that trigger PIIAs. For example, going again to the US, if I can just going again to the US, you see that targeted advertising triggers the event, right? So I would say then, and just then to come back, and these are great examples, everyone. I would then come back to say that what you want to have in place first as part of your operating model for you know PIIA operations is that you want to be clear, number one, around what that trigger list is, right? And all of your departments must know what the trigger list is. Based off of, because of example, you should have a ROPA at this point, but also your privacy team, information officers team should document what those triggering activities are based off of the lay of the land, right? Particularly in the markets that you're operating in. So in South Africa, there's no list really. But we're guided by the conditions of lawful processing. We're guided by processing special personal information, and we're also guided by the harms envisaged by the Constitution, right? That's really where we live. But in other markets, you're seeing more specific lists. For example, in Europe, particularly with GDPR, you're seeing a GDPR level kind of a trigger, which is new technologies and speaks about those new technologies and also speaks about processing criminal convictions and other special categories of information. But if you go into certain jurisdictions, for example, I recently looked at the law of Germany, the BDSG. It's written in German, and no, I do not know German, but Guten Tag, I guess. And that's not German, is it? But in German law, for example, Germany has a federated model as well. And so when you get into Germany, different provinces, states would have further guidance on triggering activities. So one of the things that you see is profiling related to the public service. So particularly for the police. So when maybe from a SaaS point of view, you're providing a solution to either the SAPS or to a law enforcement agency, and this solution allows them to use biometric information to profile people and understand who they are because of maybe at the airports for the sake of people coming in and out, and one of the questions that they should be asking you as a SaaS provider is what measures are in place, and they should be doing DPIAs or PIIAs rather on them using your system within their environment. And usually you pass you pass the threshold when you've designed the controls into your various solutions. Thanks, John. Guten Tag is German. Yay. Oh, Richard, let me try to give you allowed to talk. Please go ahead. See, you have your hand up.
So,
Yeah.
Kelly, apologies. I think I accidentally clicked on low on hand.
No, no problem, no problem. But in your organization, what are processing activities that you think might trigger a PIIA?
Oh, it's similar to what the guys have already said. Whenever you got system changes, hardware, software changes that governs the flow of this data. Currently, we got busy integrating our software via APIs with MediClinic, for example. So we can make consent much easier instead of bouncing between different practices. So, there's concerns that we'll look what's accessible, not accessible, and where it could be a concern, or security was tightened or closed.
100%. So the very questions that you're asking now is the beginnings of the PIA process. But I definitely do agree with you. Exploring different APIs, integrating different systems. I'm currently doing a PIA with the client where they are doing system integrations and also doing system migrations as well. So that is definitely a point to do a PIA, and particularly when you look at the system that, for example, my client is looking at is dealing with different kinds of personal information. It includes medical information, HR-based information because of the kind of business that they engaged in, and using that information for certain processing activities. And it's also core within their within how they process information. So, thanks everyone, I think, for that. It's a good sense. So I want to take a 10-minute break now, just to give you a breather, and then we'll come back and get into the next session, which really we're speaking about now operationalizing it. What does it look like? And then, yeah, we can have a discussion from there. So giving you a breather for coffee or a comfort break, and then we can get straight into it. So the time now is 11:13. So at 11:23, let's all get back and then get into the next session. Thank you.
Everyone, just give us a thumbs up if you're back. One going. All right, we're back. So in the first section, just to recap, we went through the background of your PIA, DPIAs, or PIAs, depending on which legislation you're going through. That's what we focused on, and we started unpacking the different trigger events that we can have. We had a good discussion around that. Going forward, our next section will look at operationalizing privacy by design or deployment, and then we'll move into an interactive group exercise where we'll sort of stimulate the DPIAs, or do a simulation rather of what this might look like in practice. So Kayla will take us through that, and then we will go through a Q&A session. So if you've got any thoughts or comments or questions so long that you have or you want to raise, you can welcome to pop that in the chat so long. If not, you're welcome to hold it to the end. And then we'll just wait for Zwakile to come online, and then hopefully you can take it away. I think he might just be having a technical issue. Let me just check, and then we can go ahead from there.
Hello.
Glad to see you've sorted your issue out there. Thank you, Zwakile.
Thank you so much. Apologies for that. I got a phone call. You know how the day goes. And then my technical stuff went off because my phone is connected to my laptop. All right. So Taylor has given a recap. Thank you, Taylor. Wanted to start off. Are there any questions before we move on ahead? Questions, insights,
No
thoughts?
questions at this point, Swakile.
Yeah, thank you. Wanted to check of those who have said that they've done a PIIA, want to start off there. What have been some of your challenges in doing a PIIA? So now we know what a PIIA is, when you need to do a PIIA. If anybody would volunteer themselves in any challenges that they've faced in actually conducting PIIAs. Yes, Maria. Let me give you speaking rights. There we go. Please
Okay,
go
can
ahead.
you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
I can.
Okay. So just on the PRA or the DPRA, we do have one. But what we've done is we've got sort of a questionnaire that we typically use when we are dealing with third parties. Or third parties or systems, or even when we are doing surveys, and we typically ask a couple of questions from a privacy data governance. It's got information security and of course architecture. So we, based on that, our enterprise architecture team then does a conceptual architecture and all those things. And in there we get a better view around the project that's underway, etc. This typically also helps us when it comes to our contracting with our legal counsel around, from the types of, the processing of information, if it's highly sensitive, or again, we do take a risk-based approach. We currently are going to be using our DPRA for one of our big projects that's actually migrating to the cloud. And it was one of the requirements of the cloud service provider, which was quite interesting. So I think and I'm looking at our questionnaire at the moment, it is very detailed, and this is where our business people typically say, you know what, this is too much, too detailed. So we have to look at what is fit for purpose. And some of it may have been dealt with prior to the initiation of the project. So I think it's very important. It's got to be fit for purpose. And unfortunately, in our case, we're doing the DPIA in flight while we are busy with the project. So that's just some insights from our side.
Thanks, Maria. That's pretty interesting. I mean, the first thing around your context is that there's so many assessments, right, that you need to do. I mean, when you look at your third parties, I'm thinking about vendor risk assessments, right? And those
Correct.
vendor risk assessments also have almost an air of data protection, but the purpose is very different, right? It's really around assessing whether when the vendor comes in, what's the risk associated with working with them, right?
Correct.
Then you've got your transfer impact assessments. I mean, if you're talking about cloud and migration and all those kinds of things, things might be moving to different aspects, different countries, for example, that they weren't in before. Even if they're in the same country, you need to demonstrate that you've thought about and asked those questions.
Yeah.
Then you have the PIA, right, which is really
Yes.
focused on the processing activity itself. And I think it's natural and it's normal that teams are frustrated by this because I like to think about the PIA as a process rather than a document. So when you said questionnaire, really happy about that. But that's one aspect of it. I mean, I want to share one of our questionnaires, which are really long, and it's quite an intense process. But I think the first things first is understanding what you're doing. And I think when you're in flight, it's difficult to be clear and calm around what's happening here. You're managing risk with the vendor, you're looking at the processing activity, you're looking at whether this processing activity is also there's transferring taking place. And that doesn't necessarily need to be one assessment. In fact, whenever it's one assessment, it causes quite a lot of confusion because non-legal stakeholders, right, and non-privacy stakeholders tend to not know where to plug in. And so it's almost like this process that you need to design and bring in people. And I'm going to go over the process, bring in people where they need to be brought in, and also not bring them in where they shouldn't be because it might cause further confusion in the way in which you're deploying your PIIAs. So, thank you for that. Thank you for that insight. I'm quite keen also around because those questions also you're looking at cybersecurity questions and
Correct.
resilience questions, and some of those questions, for example, are in your instance are very relevant because you're looking at a system. But if the processing activity that you're looking at is not system based, then they are not as relevant as they would have been, for example, in a technology context. So it's and this is like I tend to say that PIAs are a tough thing. I mean, they're a great tool that you can use, I think, for many things, but they're a tough thing to get done because of just how many moving parts, and you can't necessarily not even necessarily, you really can't do a one size fits all because the processing activity is always going to be different, and the kinds of considerations you're going to be looking at are going to be based on what you're actually processing. But thanks for that, Maria. Hopefully, as we go through the process, you also have some more insights around how that process has been for you. Does anybody else want to share any insights around?
There's two
Yeah.
comments for you in the chat, Wakele.
Thank you. Let me go look at them. Mark, yes. Mark says getting them to complete the PIA and then incomplete answers. I think I'm keen to understand, Mark. So do you also have a questionnaire, a template that you maybe send to them and ask them to complete, and then you get that one back? Is that the way in which you approach it? You can, I guess, add it in the comment section. Let me see the chat. If I'm able to open. Yes. And then with Marilee, the department heads are not well versed in PAPIA. Maybe compliance culture, given the size of our group, then all the work in respect to PIAs can unfortunately not be done by the 100%. The IO, the data protection, and the deputy IO is not generally kept in the loop when new software is onboarded. 100%. So I think feeding into also Mark's question, the insight there or rather Mark's challenges, is that PIAs, unlike the other assessments, right? Unlike your legitimate interest assessment, transfer impact assessment, even, PIAs rely heavily on collaboration. And thanks, Jan. I actually wanted to talk about OneTrust. Actually, if you don't mind unmuting yourself, Mark, Jan, as well, to just speak a bit more about OneTrust and how that can also help in some of these instances.
Yeah, sure. Jan, I don't know if you want to take the lead on this.
No, please go.
Yeah, Zakwele, thank you. Like I said, we're using OneTrust. I think our biggest challenge is the fact that people tend to see this as one of those compliance hurdles, which they just have to overcome, which leads to incomplete answers, a back and forth. Yeah, overall, we're very happy with OneTrust, and it works well. But I think it's the back and forth that frustrates us.
No, 100%. Jan, any?
Yeah, okay. I think the challenge is that in some cases we get phenomenally well completed assessments, and all the information is then used to determine if we have to do a DPA with that organization for that specific processing activity. But in other cases, we always have to do some follow-up meetings to just get clarity on the question answers. And yeah, it's inadequate. So there's a difference in the way that people complete the assessments. We've tried to use some of the show logic in OneTrust to reduce the number of questions that is not relevant to that specific case. But it is a challenge for some of the respondents that says it takes too long, it's too many questions. I don't have time for this.
Thanks, Jan. And what I'm going to do, I think later for everybody's benefit, is that I'm going to just show you OneTrust and what PIA off of OneTrust then would look like, and we'll go through it together. And that's when you use software to do your PIA. But maybe let me just go back to my screen, and thank you everyone for that participation. I really enjoy your insights. I'm enjoying your insights and hearing from you. And hopefully everybody else then is also learning from each other. So sharing my screen now. Please let me know when you can see it. Can you see it? No.
No.
Yep. Just when I go around telling people I'm a tech lawyer, and then I get disappointed by technology from time to time.
There we
Right.
go.
So before I get into the roadmap, I want to talk about the DNA of a DPIA/PIA, right? Now, remember, from the session as we've been moving along, where I've been with you is that we're following best practice, right? Because from a PAPIA point of view, PAPIA doesn't have a lot of guidance. So if I go back, remember I said earlier on that the only time that you're really going to see PIIA is here. And then you're left thinking, now, how do I do one? How do I design one? What should I do? And. And remember, PAPIA empowers us to look to other regulators doing better and then learn from them. Okay, so let's head over to Europe. Now, Article 35 is where you're looking to, right? Around DPIAs. And subsection 7 then becomes the more important one, which really outlines the DNA of a DPIA. So Mark spoke about a questionnaire. Maria spoke about a questionnaire. Jan also spoke about, getting response from people. What are they responding to? And how are you crafting these questions? So from a general, I was about to say the whole name of the GDPR, General Data Protection. So from a GDPR point of view, there's 4 sections, 4 parts to your to your PIIA that needs to be there. Firstly, you have a systematic description of the envisaged processing operations and the purposes of the processing, which include legitimate interests pursued by the controller. Now, you remember from a legitimate interest point of view, we're looking about the justification, so for processing. So you've got the conditions, and then you've got the 8 conditions, but then you've got the 6 justifications. Consent being one of them, performance of a contract, another one, performance of in compliance with the law. There's a public duty. Then there's the legitimate interest aspects of it, legitimate interest of the data subject and the legitimate interest of your organization in processing. So what GDPR says that where applicable, which is where you're relying on legitimate interests to process, there also should be a legitimate interest aspect to the design of your PIIA, right? So what we're seeing that if you want your PIIA to be GDPR compliant, there has to be a section that speaks about what the processing activity is. 1. 2, there has to be a section that speaks about what the purpose of that processing is. And 3, if you are relying on legitimate interests, and particularly your legitimate interest to process, there has to be a section that then speaks to that. And over and above that, I would go as far as then asking for a legitimate interest assessment, which is a separate assessment to the actual PIIA. So that's part 1. Let's call it section 1, we're designing. Section 2 of your PIA. You need to then do an assessment of the necessity and proportionality of the processing operations, right? So now you've got a purpose. I'm processing because I want to provide credit, right? Now, is it necessary? And the processing activity is a piece of machine learning that is able to read a person's profile, get their credit score, and then give them a response within a minute on whether they go on to the next step or not, which is a step where their application needs to be further processed. And that the business decision there really is so that you can get through more credit applications in a day, and that also that the people who need to review the credit applications are reviewing applications that have met a particular criteria. That's the processing activity that you want to do. So then you describe that, and here you're not relying on legitimate interest. You literally are relying on it could be a contract if they're your existing customer, or it could be that they're pursuing a new relationship with you and they're a prospect. Which legitimate interest actually may be the one in which you rely on. But after you've got the raw facts, right? So the first part of your PIA needs to be the facts. The second part of your PIA then needs to be an assessment. What is that? You're assessing necessity and proportionality. So is it necessary that we process this way to meet the purpose? That's the question. Is it is it necessary that we use machine learning to meet the process of reviewing applications? Then there's different kinds of legs which you can go in around assessing necessity. Again, what's useful here is if, for example, the product team has a product spec document. So usually there's a business case in most organizations where the business says we have a case for developing this product or this functionality or this service, commercial. Can you take a look at our business case? This is how we'll make money out of it. This is how we'll maybe reduce certain redundancies in the process, and look at it. That business case document, if you have one, would be great if you do, is useful for this necessity assessment, because you can use that to then explain that based off of what's reasonably practicable within your organization, remember that's PAPIA, the purpose of the processing is best met by the actual processing itself that you are proposing. That's the necessity aspect of it. Then the proportionality aspect of it is looking at the infringement on the data subject's rights. So are you, when you look at, for example, taking someone's biometric information, are you taking that biometric information simply to grant, I don't know, someone access to your website? That's a bit crazy. When you look at proportionality, you want to be using the least invasive processing mechanism to meet that same to meet that purpose that you're looking for. And this part is where the conditions of lawful processing come to play. So if we go back and we're looking at these conditions, this is where you literally are applying these conditions at step 2, right? An assessment of necessity and proportionality. So I literally am going at 1, is there something to speak about from a responsibility point of view? Is there something to speak about from a processing limitation point of view? Further processing, information quality, and all the way down. And the kinds of questions that you're asking need to then meet this. And so this is where, in this instance, it's a collaboration. So here it's just a factual exercise. So for example, the financial team or the tech team that developed this product can speak about the facts, right? And then maybe the legal person is going to come in just to rationalize the purpose aspect, whether that purpose aspect meets the PAPIA thresholds. And I'm going to be focusing a bit on PAPIA, but using best practice to then help almost design this DPIA that we're looking at. And also from a justifications point of view. Now, when you are coming to the assessment point of view, this requires a trained eye. So someone who understands the conditions of lawful processing, understands PAPIA relatively well, understands the business activity taking place fairly well. And so already you're seeing someone a bit more senior and is able to bring those two worlds together. That's what's happening from an assessment of necessity and proportionality point of view. So it can be someone who sits in compliance, can be someone who sits in risk, can be someone who sits in the information officer's table, but is rarely someone who's going to sit in business itself, because business usually is concerned with just the processing activity and won't go the extra mile of applying their minds to how that processing activity meets the threshold of the conditions for lawful processing and PAPIA generally. Then, so that's section 2. Section 3 then says, okay, now we've got the facts. Now we've made an assessment of the necessity and proportionality of the processing activity against the data subject rights and the conditions of lawful processing. Let's now look at the risks themselves. So now we're doing the risk exercise. And remember, what is risk? Risk is impact and its impact and its likelihood, and how those two things then give you an inherent risk. And when you apply a control, they then give you a residual risk. That's the formula. So now we are actually looking at the risks to the rights and freedoms of data subjects. This is almost always a purely legal or risk activity. Why? Because you're now looking at if, for example, the data subject's right is access to information. You are looking at will that right be diminished for their access to the information? And that's almost a legal assessment more than it is a operational commercial assessment, which the second is almost a combination of the two. And this is where, remember, I said your risk methodology becomes important. So taking your general risk management framework, bringing it within the context of POPIA, and then and that context is influenced by data subject rights, the conditions of lawful processing, and the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa, right? Based off of those harms that are envisaged. You take those and then you risk rate what's taking place. So now you're at a place where it is necessary to process this way, and you are proportional. You have exercised proportionality in your processing operations. So you're using the proportional measure to the purpose that you want out of that. Now it is, what is the risk of doing it this way, right? What's the risk on each one of the data subject's rights? So you can have a list of those data subject rights, say no risk, no risk, no risk, no risk. Maybe there's a risk here. And just as a base level, you start with the data subject rights as envisaged in POPIA. You also look at the harms as envisaged in the Constitution, particularly in your harming certain groups, children, the elderly, women, disabled people, people based on race, and those then become your triggers, which you can, as you'll see later on, try to customize also into your through conditional rules in your maybe your OneTrust stack or whatever stack you're using for your software that you're using to deploy your PIAs. And then the last part, right? So you've got 4 sections. We've got the factual picture. You've got your assessment of necessity and proportionality. We've now assessed the risks to the rights and freedoms based off of that lens that I just gave you. And then now finally, you're looking at the measures envisaged to address the risks, of the controls, right? What controls do you want to put in place to reduce the risk, so that you then are now sitting at a residual risk, which is more palatable than the what the inherent risk then is. And then you go on into the sunset to then do your remediation plan. So when you're in flight, for example, as you said, Maria, is that you probably would have gotten to the point of the controls. You are applying them while still doing the assessment, because maybe someone is having a bright idea whilst you're doing the assessment. And it's almost like this, you need to work agile. So there you're going to have to really be keep your finger on the pulse insofar as whilst things are being if things are being implemented before you have an outcome out of your PIIA, you already are thinking about how that applies, right? It's almost like you're juggling quite a few balls, and which is why it becomes really challenging when you do it that way. But sometimes business is messy, and the way in which we do things aren't as clear cut as they are. So this is a way in which you can then approach that. And then you then give owners. So you give those controls to owners. I think all of you on the call then understand, compliance risk management. You follow the ordinary compliance risk management approach. You give people owners, and then you monitor in those controls, and then your PIA needs to be reviewed on an ongoing basis. So that's what a GDPR compliant PIA then should look like. If I go on to ICO, ICO has the same, they even have, ICO is the Information Commissioner's Office that's based in the UK. They have quite a lot of guidance, and they also have like a DPIA checklist and assessment. You can look at it as well. But really the conditions that are required follow much of what the GDPR then is asking for, but there's more explanatory notes and guidance notices on them on the ICO website. Then let's move over to China. China doesn't necessarily have an approach. If we look at if you look at the DPIA process, it's not exactly the same approach, but the DNA is the same, right? So you go over to Article 56, and then it says what needs to be included in your DPIA is a purpose and a method of processing, right? That matches the GDPR, a description of the envisaged processing, right? So already if you are wanting to be compliant in China and Europe, you need to have a description of the processing activity. And then where required a legitimate interest assessments, and that's pretty much the same. Impact on the data subject's rights and interests and security risk. That's the risk approach, risk management approach that we just spoke about, which is Section 3 in GDPR. And then whether security protection measures are taken are legitimate, effective, appropriate, and to the degree. So they've switched around the proportionality, but also mixed it as well with assessing the actual controls in place as well. And it really is so it has three parts, but you can see that it's more or less the same as the GDPR process. And then it says that, the PIA report, it must be kept for at least 3 years. And this already gives you a sense that if you're using your OneTrust or you're using software, that you need to be keeping, for at least from a Chinese point of view, your data retention policies and records, or policies and SOPs that are embedded in the software need to at least have a 3-year mark on the PIA specifically. That lives on your system, and if you're not using software, then you're recording it and keeping it in a document in a SharePoint, Google Drive, what are the other guys, Dropbox, wherever it is, for at least 3 years. And so as part of your retention schedule, you need to put this in there to say that documents or records that are PIIAs must be kept for at least 3 years if you want to comply with the Chinese example, well, with Chinese law. In Virginia, again, there's this identify and weigh the benefits. So they don't have, that nice step-by-step, but it says that what needs to be included is identifying and weighing the benefits that may flow directly and indirectly. That's more your second section around necessity and proportionality. But of course, you've described what that is. And then you go through that whole process. And I mean, when they talk about de-identifying data, they're now getting into the mechanics of the controls that you're putting in place, what kind of controls that you're putting in place for certain trigger events or processing activity trigger events that they want to see in place. And Nigeria, the same. They also have this DNA of a DPIA, which speaks about a description of the processing activity and the purpose, speaks about an assessment of necessity and proportionality, an assessment of the risks and freedoms. This is more or less the GDPR example, and then also speaks about the measures that are put in place. So where we're landing now is that there is a DNA to a PIA, right? We're looking at 4 sections. 1, a section that describes the processing activity. 2, a section that speaks to the necessity and proportionality. 3, a section that speaks to the risk assessment aspect of it. And lastly, a section that's speaking to the controls and the remediation plan. That generally is your PIA, DPIA, PIPIA, PIA, and LOL. So that really is the DNA of it. And I think just want to pause here and hear from those who've done their DPIAs, is this how you've generally structured your PIIs as well? Let me see, is there anything in the chat? Okay. So, and I'm going to share, if you're using OneTrust, this is how it would probably be, because OneTrust follows the same methodology. So not worried about the OneTrust guys. But this is generally how your, so that's generally the DNA of a PIA, a PIIA rather. Now, to go back to where the challenges then are. So I've explained, in very simple language, what, it would look like as a report. But the PIIA is fundamentally an assessment, right? It's not the report is what comes at the end. And this is an important thing to understand, because once you understand it as an assessment, you understand it as a process, right? And every process has steps, right? Has different role players in those steps, different tools used in those steps, and there's different people, and there's different requirements in each one of those steps. So now to successfully complete, Maria, we have based our DPIA policy on the key components of GDPR. Perfect, yes. So what you're looking at now is what are the steps that you need to follow, who owns what, and how then do you run a tight ship, right? So everything that I've spoken about up until this point is an important building block. One, remember earlier on in the session, we had spoken about the operating model that you use within your organization to manage privacy. 2, we'd spoken about the foundations of privacy. 3, we'd spoken about the different trigger activities. And now we're talking about the DNA of a PIIA. So fundamentally, a PIIA is a process, right? That's the first thing that's important to understand and for the whole business to then understand. It's a process with multiple steps in that process, and in each one of those steps, there's different role players who are doing different things, all for the purpose of getting certain information to get a report at the end that you can then use to then guide whatever activities that you're doing. So the first thing you start is a PIA appropriate? Now, when you're asking who's asking is a PIA appropriate, it should be the business asking is a PIA appropriate, right? So the business needs to be sufficiently trained on knowing when a PIA is required within their functional areas. What's the best mechanism to do this? If you had done an inclusive ROPA exercise, and an inclusive ROPA exercise looks like, and the ways in which I run mine is you have a ROPA template, you send it to the different business units, and you ask them, you set up time with them to go through their processing activities. So you don't leave them in the dark. You literally are workshopping them. This is the information I'm looking for from you. This is why I need this information, and very tedious, but very important. So it's the business that should be empowered to determine whether a PIA is necessary or not, but they should be working with the information officer's team to determine those. So from a business point of view, you want to make sure that the teams know what the different trigger events are for them. So does marketing know what a trigger event would be for them and which processing activities they need to be monitoring as far as the Europa is concerned? And then they need to describe the processing. And so if you're looking at, for example, a RASI approach to accountability, who's responsible, who's accountable, who needs to be consulted, and who needs to be informed, the information officer is ultimately responsible, right, for all of it, or ultimately accountable rather for it, right? But from a responsibility point of view, it could be the business units based on their processing activities, but they need to be sufficiently trained about processing activities, their ropers, and what they need to consider when processing personal information for them to be of any use when a trigger event is taking place, right? In their development, R&D, in different kinds of considerations. So from an appropriateness point of view, describing the processing point of view, and describing the scope of the processing point of view, the business unit should be heavily involved here. But really, because this is a process that should be owned by the information officer, someone from the information officer's team needs to be the key custodian for the process, right? So, so that when they have questions, that's the first point of call that they ask that the business asks from. So if they're asking, if it's an appropriateness question, if there's no SOP, then that person needs to be responsible for training them. Describing the processing activity, they then maybe would have different wordings that the teams can use to describe their processing activity. But I don't know if you're noticing that steps 1, 2, 3, and 4 is information that you could be getting directly from your roper. So if you've done your roper well, and this is instances where you're in flight and you're not necessarily doing it in advance. If you've done your roper well, you should be able to export this information, right? If you haven't done your roper, if you haven't done a processing activity haven't included this processing activity within the roper, then because you would have worked with the business units on doing the roper in any event, you're pretty much following the same process with them around this new processing activity. Let's do the same thing with it that we did with the roper. So essentially, this first step is a roper mirroring process. But then the outcomes, the description and the lot is then going to be included in your report. Then you do stakeholder consultation here. So who's owning the specific process? How are they, and who do you need to then, who are the different people who need to be consulted and informed about this processing activity? And this stakeholder consultation process, you can either if you're using a system like OneTrust, deploy the assessment to certain people for them to complete certain sections and then send those things back to you. Or if you're doing it more manually, then literally it's you emailing people and say, can I set up time with you? I'm going to send you a questionnaire ahead of time. This is the section that I need to engage you on. Can we discuss it maybe for 30 minutes and then I can go on about my way? Because the stakeholder consultation needs to be managed by someone. And that person who's going to be managing it needs to be from the information officer's desk, because ultimately the information officer is responsible for having the PIA, as you saw through section 4.1b of POP here. Then you do your necessity and proportionality assessment. And this is where your skills trained eye comes in. It's more going to be your team, the likes of yourself, Maria, the likes of yourself, Jan, the likes of yourself, Mark, who are then going to be tasked with doing the necessity and proportionality aspect because of the understanding of the business and also of POPIA. You need to bring those two things together. And this needs to be documented in the report. So through this process, we're having a working paper, but this working paper is going to output is going to ultimately give us a report. Then you identify the risks, and hopefully you have a risk management framework that you use, designed in the way in which we've spoken about, and that matrix needs to be on the report so that whoever's reading the report, you're using the language of the business to risk rate, and it's also clear why a risk has been identified to be at a particular rate. And then you go through the risk mitigation process, and this is really the in organization process, and you've got your action implementation, which is based off of the controls that you've identified at this point, and then you go on to review every 3 years or wherever it becomes necessary. This is generally your roadmap when it comes to personal information. Personal information impact assessment. So really, how you operationalize this is you need to understand the life cycle of your business units. So how does marketing work? How does IT work? How does the sales guys work? How do all of these teams work so that you know when to integrate the PIA into what they're doing already, right? It's the same with the lawyers, right? So whenever the sales team is engaging as a client, they don't engage us when they are talking about the products. They don't engage us when they are saying this is what the product can do. They only engage us when the client says, okay, we want to work with you. What's your proposal? And how then do we start working with each other? Because now there's an agreement. So understanding the sales cycle helps lawyers understand where they fit into the process. The same is true here. Understanding the marketing cycle through campaigns, understanding the product development cycle for your product managers and your IT guys becomes important so that you embed the PIIA into their existing process. And remember, what that looks like is you're looking at their process and matching this process to that process. So when you're asking, is a PIA appropriate? When would they be asking that? They should be asking that at the point of a business case. So if the product team wants a business case or has a business case for a new product, at that point in time when the business case is ready, they should be starting to ask, is a PIIA necessary for us to do that, for us to succeed with this business case? And so the process of product development is almost in parallel with the process of the PIA. And that's how you start getting the integrations and the collaborations that you want to see. And you might even go into these different departments, ask them questions around how they do their work, and then say, listen, we need to make sure that when you're developing and doing this, that you're thinking about this thing. Can I then come in with your team and then maybe do a quick presentation about what we are requiring from you? And then maybe you collaborate around how do we embed our process into your process when you are deciding on new products and business cases that involve personal information. So that really is the big thing. So that's where you then get those points of collaboration. And you need to be able to work agile. Why? Because the teams are trying to meet their process and meet their outcomes. And whatever you're doing is an additional step to what they already have to do. So you want to be able to understand what they're doing and match that to what you need out of them. And that really is around understanding where they fit in and how you then fit in, where they fit into each step of this process and how you fit into their process. So that if they have maybe turnaround times for a business case that is a week, this process, maybe moving from here to stakeholder consultation, can't take more than a week. Otherwise, you lose their focus and you lose their buy-in. So it really is about integrating into the business and not having a PIIA that lives outside of that. And that's how I think is the best way of getting that kind of collaboration you need, which is critical for getting a useful PIA out there. Then lastly, it's the tools and templates to use. I see on time we're not doing that great. So I want to then just quickly move on to just on this tools and templates. So we spoke about the DNA of a PIA. And so that's a DNA generally that from a best practice point of view, you should be sticking to. But then based off of that DNA, you should have a process that is not only understood by you, but the rest of the business as well. And the rest of the business understands how their processes fit into your process and your process fits into their process. And that's where you're going to see collaboration there. And the ways in which you can do this is software, right? So I'm doing OneTrust now, but there's different kinds of software that you can use. I'm doing OneTrust now on conducting a PIA, which is just an example of what you can do with software. I'm not going to get into a full line demo, but essentially this is what your landing page would look like. So it's when you use software, you break down the points, the information collection that you need, and then you can assign certain people to then fill out some of these sections. So I've assigned this to myself, so I'm going to fill this out myself. And these should be speaking and aligning to what is required in law and what the DNA of a PIA then looks like. So this is more that first section. You then look at the collection aspect of it. This is the standard OneTrust PIA. You look at notice, this is particularly when you're looking at the impact on data subjects, notice on the collection of the information and the using this information in a new way, use, what's the data going to be used for? You can have pre-populated, and these sections can match to the actual departments that you have in your organization. Access, who's going to get access. Essentially, it's a whole long process. And then once you're done with this, once it goes under review, essentially you're getting the information here. It comes back to you, then you go through the risk process, the risk management process, the risk assessment particularly process. And you can also embed that within the actual assessment that you would have deployed. This is a OneTrust example, but you also could have an actual physical questionnaire. The only thing is that you need to, because you're not clicking buttons here, you need to be aware of the process. So what step of the process are you in managing the life cycle of a PIA? What step of the process are you in? Who is within is part of that process? And what kind of insights are you looking for them that you then gather and put into a finalized report? So that really is, that's from a OneTrust point of view. So wanted to do a group exercise with you, but we've only got 20 minutes. So instead of doing maybe a group exercise, I'd like to open up the floor to you, and you can maybe just troubleshoot any questions, challenges that you have, or maybe advice that you maybe might want, or guidance that you might need in doing your PIAs currently. So opening the floor and then just raise your hand and then we'll unmute you and you can speak.
Not looking like we've got any questions.
Okay.
I think you've done such a good job that everyone's clear.
I'm finished. So maybe let me try to tackle some of those those questions from before. So how do you manage incomplete? So number one, how do you get people to complete the PIA? You get people to complete the PIA by, in my opinion, embedding the PIA into their existing processes. And one, they need to know what it is and how it features into their process. And so there's a lot of training and awareness that needs to go into there, and that's beyond the training and awareness that we've discussed. So people need to know what you need from them, how that aligns with what they're doing for them to give you that. So maybe looking at particularly, you'd know who you've got a pretty good sense around where you're probably going to see innovation, where you're probably going to see new processing activities. And so you then want to get those people trained up, work with their executives, get maybe your executive to sponsor you to talk to their executive. And you almost have this executive buy-in on, can I come in? Can my team come in and give you some training, give your guys training so that we then can get output from the PIAs that we're doing and that we need you to do, and also to be part of the process. So it's more of a softer skill than it is a legal and a harder skill. You just need to be get buy-in, and that buy-in can be a collaboration between the top management talking to each other, but then people understanding how all of this fits into their process, and availability, getting your availability when they need it. And with the incomplete answers questions, that's usually under two instances. One, someone doesn't understand what you're asking for. So if it's possible to get, pre-populated, or rather options instead of people writing down, that's better, but sometimes that's not possible. So you want to put explainers around the information that you're looking for. Sometimes it's even like these short form content videos that maybe go hand in hand, and could live in a SharePoint somewhere around. When you could doing a PIA, go to this folder, and Jan gives you there's a video of Jan going through a PIA, and that just lives there. And so anybody who needs to do a PIA, needs to complete the section, goes to that video and views that. Two, people don't have capacity. So they might know what you're asking for them, but they don't have capacity to do what you're asking from them. So the question then there is a resource management conversation. And some of those resource management issues you can't solve yourself, because there's literal head count challenges, or someone might be new, and so you want to be working with the departments around where they don't have to complete. And I know this is more work for you, and because the information officer is ultimately accountable, this rests on their team. But sometimes you might look at a solution where they are talking to you and you're actually doing the manual filling in. And so you are the quality assurance step. And so that quality assurance step involves not only reviewing the answers, but then also going back to the business and sitting down with them to get the quality information that you're looking for. So those, I think, the two ways to approach that. There's only so much that a system can do. There's only so much that a process can do. Sometimes you actually need like human beings to then engage other human beings, and that's how you then start getting the ball moving. Of course, this is based off of the resources that you have available. And then if you're looking at, if you're using a system, sometimes people aren't used to that system. So there might be additional training beyond training on the content itself of a PIA. It might be a system literacy issue as well. So you want to know the root cause of incomplete answers and getting people to complete answers so that you address that root cause. And sometimes remediating that root cause doesn't necessarily sit with you. You can work with HR, you can work with the actual business function as well to remediate there. But if you don't have a root cause understanding, then the issue will then persist. And then department heads are not well versed. Again, Marilee, that's also a awareness issue. And so you want to have a sufficient level of awareness within your business, because this is almost advanced data protection law. It's not basic. And so because it's advanced, people are going to miss it. For example, when you're doing a necessity and proportionality test, it's not going to be understood by most, and that's why it needs to live within the information officer's team and not in the rest of the business, because there's certain things that they're not going to be able to understand. And also be careful of the questionnaires that you give the business. So the great thing about platforms like OneTrust and the other ones, the software base, is that they give you chunks. But when you're doing it manually, you sometimes are giving someone 100 questionnaire, and that is overwhelming. So you want to maybe lean in on the process rather than the questionnaire, and break that questionnaire down. And at each part, you maybe break that questionnaire down into maybe different tabs on the same Excel spreadsheet, or different documents altogether. You send that document out, you get maybe feedback on that document, you send that, but whatever ways to make it more less intimidating and more accessible to the people that you need input from. So that's really me at this point in time. Thank you so much for your time. What I'm going to do after the session is we will, I'm going to send you this one pager, right? The 8 steps to do a personal information impact assessment, so that you can see these steps. And the great thing to do would be taking these steps and then going to go assess the looking at the different processes within the different business units that you need to do PIAs with, and then trying to match those. So if you need to check if a PIA is needed, how do you fit into someone else's process? And where do you fit in there? If you need to describe the processing activity, how do you fit into that? So that's how this could be really helpful in establishing and creating a relationship with the rest of the team. And then you'll also get a recording of the session as well, to just, if you want to go over any of the points that we touched on. And then I also do encourage you to reach out to me. So if there's any specific questions, I think to this group that's here, I'm offering you 30 minutes. So reach out to me on my email address, zwagele@michaelsons.com. And any one of you can reach out to me for 30 minutes. We can discuss any issues that you have, and then take it from there. So thank you a lot. Thank you, Taylor. If there's any questions, there's my email there. Any feedback? Lastly, sorry, Taylor, please issue the feedback poll. Always love to get feedback from you on how we did here and any points that we can do better. So was the webinar accessible, empowering, and helpful? Did you learn new things? If there's anything room for improvement, feel free to email me directly. I don't mind. I love feedback. Thank you so much, everyone. I see the feedback there, and then for our next one, we'll address those. So please send if there's any questions that you have, send me an email, and then hoping to hear from you soon. Cheers, bye.